Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Asha Roan, and I'm the Manager of Programs, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Cancer Support Community in Greater Cincinnati. We are one of over 50 affiliates of national network that provides social and emotional support for anyone impacted by cancer. Thank you for virtually joining us for Food Label Lingo. Here at CSC, we provide healthy lifestyle classes, social opportunities, and educational programs like this one to anyone impacted by cancer. In addition, we offer support and networking groups to give and get support. To learn more about our services or any of our programs, please visit our website at mycancersupportcommunity.org or call us at 513-791-4060. Just a few things to cover before we get started. Everyone has been placed on mute for the duration of the program to cut down on background noise and allow everyone a chance to hear the speaker. You may also notice that we are recording this lecture. We are doing so for future use and to make sure everyone has access to our programs. Please know that your name and face will not be shown in the video, and we will make all possible attempts to maintain privacy. If there are any specific concerns, please use the chat button to contact me. Please make sure you are identified correctly for attendance purposes. If your name does not show under your picture, please use the chat button on the bottom middle of your screen and choose my name from the drop-down box to send me your correct name. If you have any questions, please save them all to the end of the presentation. If there are any specific concerns throughout the program, please use the chat button to contact me. Now I would like to introduce our presenter this afternoon, Lisa Andrews. Lisa Andrews is a registered dietitian and owner of Sound Bites Nutrition in Cincinnati. She shares her nutrition knowledge through cooking demonstrations, teaching, freelance writing. Lisa is a regular contributor to Food and Health Communications in Today's Dietitian and is the author of the Healing Gout Cookbook, Complete Thyroid Cookbook, and Heart Healthy Meal Prep Cookbook. Lisa serves as the House of Delegates, delegate-elect for the Ohio Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and has served as President Chair on Professional Issues, Media Chair, and Co-Chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Lisa's line of food pun merchandise, Let Us Beat Hunger, supports those suffering food insecurity in Cincinnati. For more information, visit her website at www.soundbitesnutrition.com. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Andrews.
Thank you so much, Asha, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon. I appreciate you joining me for Label Lingo, sorry. So let's see if my slides will move here. There we go. All right, so my topics today include what's on a food label, what's considered mandatory versus voluntary, because the nutrients that you see on a label, some will be mandated by the food industry and others will be voluntary. So for example, things like additional nutrients that might be added to a cereal, like vitamin B6 or vitamin B12, those are optional, whereas things like calcium and iron and potassium actually need to be on a label by law. I'll also discuss some of the health claims that are listed, the recommendations or regulations on organic food, and what a genetically modified organism is, which is now known as bioengineered organisms, according to the changes that have been made recently in the food label. So label requirements are regulated by the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and most prepared foods have a mandatory label, and these include breads, cereals, any canned foods or frozen foods. And what I mean by the label, obviously food will have a label on it, but I'm talking about the nutrition facts label, and that's what I'm going to primarily cover today in my talk. Snacks, desserts, and drinks will also have a label. And then any type of ground meat, whether it is ground turkey, ground beef, ground lamb, ground chicken, any major cuts of beef, so your T-bone steaks, your sirloin steaks, any cuts of beef or pork or lamb, those will also have a mandatory food label to list the type of fats that are there and the grade of the meat. As far as a voluntary label, typically you're not going to see a food label on fruits and vegetables and fish. You may see one on salmon, but again, it is a voluntary label. And when you see things like functional foods or nutraceuticals, things like yogurt or maybe vegetables that have different labels about being a quote functional food, there really isn't a specific definition by law. So some of those labels, you know, become a little bit murky to consumers because we don't really have exact definitions. Even the word natural doesn't really have a defined you know, characteristic or definition when it comes to a food label. So the mandatory things that have to be listed on a nutrition facts food label include the servings and the serving size, obviously the calories in the food or the serving, the fat, which includes the total fat, the saturated fat, the trans fat, the carbohydrate, which includes the total carbohydrate as well as the fiber, the sugars, the added sugars, and I'll go over sort of the difference between those two. We also have to have protein, sodium, cholesterol, calcium, iron, potassium, and vitamin D. Obviously, we need to list the ingredients, any allergy alerts. So there's 8 most common allergies, things like wheat and eggs and soy and shellfish need to be listed. Gluten needs to be listed. And then the company address. So if somebody has an adverse reaction to a food, you could either call the company, but if it's in the case of something that's not labeled, so maybe a fruit or vegetable has gone bad, or maybe your gallon of milk has, turned sour before the use by date, you can take those directly back to the store and either get a refund or, talk to your store manager and get a replacement item for that food. But these are the things that absolutely have to be on a food label by law. So what else might be there? As I mentioned before, when a food goes under a fortification process or an enrichment process, particularly things like either a processed food or something like a breakfast cereal or maybe an energy bar or protein bar, you might see other nutrients listed. And these do not have to be listed by law. But again, the company might want to list these just to tell you that the food has additional nutritional value. So if, for example, most of the B vitamins, things like thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, which incidentally are vitamins B1, B2, and B3, B6, B12, magnesium, some of the more common micronutrients, so copper, zinc, folic acid. If those have been added to the food, they will be listed. Vitamin E is not mandatory on a label, but again, it might be listed. And then as far as the fats go, only the total, the saturated, and the trans fat need to be on a label, but a food company like Planters or Mazola corn oil or an olive oil brand may list out the other fats, such as the unsaturated fats, either the monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fats, on that label to show you that those nutrients are present in that particular food. They don't need to be listed by law. So if you look at, for example, a box of butter and maybe it says the total fat is 10 grams and the saturated is 4.5 and the trans is 0, and you don't see anything else listed, well, those other fats that are in the food are likely the unsaturated fats that don't need to be on the label. So a lot of times they won't add up, primarily because they're just not listed on the label. If the food is organic, the company typically has paid quite a bit of money for that certification and they will list that. Gluten-free might also be listed. With the keto diet being so popular, foods are starting to be listed as keto-friendly or keto or low carb or carb conscious. You might see those other types of labels on a particular food. And then any types of health claims. So for example, on oatmeal, you'll see that soluble fiber helps to reduce the risk for heart disease, primarily because of the type of fiber that's in there. What used to be on the label are vitamins A and C, and it looks like it cut off my, somehow it cut off my notes there, but we no longer have vitamins A and C listed on the label, and it's not that those nutrients aren't important anymore, it's just that the risk for deficiency is so low. So what's replaced those two are vitamin D and potassium. Vitamin D deficiency is actually fairly common in the US. About 75% of people have a vitamin D deficiency. I would certainly recommend you have your physician or healthcare provider check it before you start taking supplements. And then potassium has a direct link with blood pressure. So we want people to get adequate potassium in their diet. Vitamins A and C, again, the likelihood for deficiency is very low. So we don't have those nutrients listed on the label anymore. And labels will change based on, healthcare research and based on consumer demand for certain products. As I mentioned with a cereal box label, and I recognize this is fairly small, but you might see that, vitamin A is listed, even though, again, it does not need to be. The type of fiber has been broken out to both soluble and insoluble. That doesn't need to be like that, but again, the company might put that there just to show you what types of fiber are in there. And below there, you'll see things like niacin, vitamin B6, zinc, folic acid. Those do not need to be there by law, but again, the company wants you to know that the food has been fortified with those particular micronutrients. But again, the ones at the top, the total fat, the saturated, the trans cholesterol, all of those are linked with poor health. So we want consumers to recognize, this is a source of cholesterol or this is a source of sodium. And then I'll talk about what those numbers on the right, the percent daily value, mean and how you can tell if a food is high or low in that nutrient. So the nutrients, for the most part, that we want people to limit because of their link with chronic disease are things like added sugar, dietary cholesterol, saturated fat, sodium, and trans fat. And what trans fat is basically liquid fat that has been changed by the addition of hydrogen. So when a company adds hydrogen to a liquid fat, whether that is cottonseed oil or soybean oil, it changes the fat from a liquid to a solid. And what we've found in research is that trans fat raises blood cholesterol just as much, if not as more, than saturated fat. And saturated fat is solid at room temperature. It's the fat that makes everything taste good. Bacon, butter, beef, bologna, those are all high in saturated fat. So we want people to be a little bit more aware of those nutrients in the food, and that's why they're on the food label. The nutrients that we want to focus on for people to increase include calcium, not only for bone health, but also for blood pressure treatment, because calcium helps lower blood pressure. Adequate calcium is also linked with the reduction of colon cancer. So we want to make sure people get enough. On the flip side, and I recognize we don't have many men on the call, but it's still important, too much calcium is actually linked with prostate cancer. So, we want to make sure people get enough of it, but we don't want people to get too much. Iron deficiency is the most common nutrient deficiency worldwide. So we want to make sure that people get enough iron in their diet, which again is why it's on the food label. The more fiber that you have in your diet, the better your gut microbiome, and the lower your risk of pretty much all-cause mortality from cancer, heart disease, obesity, diabetes. The higher your fiber intake in your diet, the better. Because typically, for the most part, unless you're eating a lot of Metamucil, the fiber from your diet is going to come from plants. So the more plant-based your diet, the more fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, the better your diet, or the better your diet quality. And again, I mentioned vitamin D and potassium because of their link with chronic disease. So vitamin D deficiency, there is a link between vitamin D deficiency and multiple sclerosis. There is a link with heart disease. There's a link with osteoporosis. So it's pretty important to get enough vitamin D in your diet. And for the most part, with a lot of people switching from cows-based milk to a plant-based milk, you may not get as much vitamin D unless that plant-based milk is fortified with vitamin D. And even then, you're probably not going to get enough unless you're having at least 3 servings of that particular food a day. Potassium, as I mentioned, is linked with blood pressure reduction. And part of the reason I have a picture of oranges there is that a really easy way to remember which foods are high in potassium is that they are dark orange or dark green. So really, ideally, I would have had like a kale salad there with some orange slices in it or some peaches or something. But if you can remember that dark green leafy vegetables, broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, spinach, those are good sources of potassium. And then anything orange in that category of sweet potatoes and cantaloupe and citrus fruits and peaches and melon, those are all good sources of potassium. So orange and green are great sources of that particular micronutrient. Okay, so when looking at what's different, I already mentioned that we took off, not we, but the food industry removed vitamins A and C from the label, but then added vitamin D and potassium to the label. And you'll see that at the bottom below protein. Now we have the serving size larger and in bolder type so people actually can see it. The serving size has also been updated. So I think that this particular food might be ice cream. So for example, previously the serving size for ice cream was considered half a cup. But when, we tested how much a person actually ate, they do consumer testing to see what a typical serving size is. They really recognize that people are eating more than a half a cup. So we want to be realistic in our serving sizes. The calories are also listed in larger types. So again, it's more kind of in your face of how much you're actually consuming. And then what that percent daily value means on the right-hand side, that compares the nutrient in the food with how much that nutrient provides for your total day's intake. And that's based on a 2000 calorie diet. So for example, a nutrient that is 5% or less of the daily value is low in that nutrient. And a nutrient that is 20% or more is high in that nutrient. So I mentioned that this might be ice cream, but now I'm thinking it might be something else because it doesn't have any cholesterol in it. I don't really know what this food is. However, an easy rule of thumb is if the nutrient is 5% or less, it's low. If it's 20% or more, it's high. And if it's somewhere in between there, then you kind of have to make your best guess. For example, if something has 18% of the daily value for saturated fat, that's pretty darn close to 20. So that's going to be high in that nutrient. Some nutrients you want more of. So again, we want to see people eating more fiber. We want people to get enough vitamin D and calcium and iron and potassium in their diets. Some things we want less of. So we don't want too much sodium. We don't want too much cholesterol because both of those are linked with heart disease and high blood pressure. The other changes are that we have broken out sugars to include added sugars. And a really good example of that would be something like chocolate milk. Obviously, chocolate milk is sweetened, but milk in general, or yogurt, or really any dairy products, with the exception of maybe cheese, all of those contain natural sugar. So all of those contain lactose. It's a really small amount of lactose in cheese, but most of it you're going to find in ice cream and yogurt and milk. If you just look at milk by itself and look at the sugars, it looks like a lot of sugars. And any type of sugar will obviously break down into, glucose that's going to be used for energy. But something like milk is really packed with a lot of other nutrition. So we don't want people to avoid it because they think there's too much sugar. So what the food industry has done is broken out those added sugars to tell people this particular food has added sugar as a sweetener. So again, if you look at the added sugars, that's the sweetener in the product and not necessarily the natural sugar that's there. Same thing with like breakfast cereal. So breakfast cereal obviously is made up of grains for the most part, whether it is corn or wheat or rice, but the added sugars are going to be what's in there as a sweetener. So if you have something like frosted mini wheats, it's probably going to be fairly high in carbohydrate because it's wheat, it's a grain. But it is still a very good source of fiber, but it may have some added sugar just from, the coating. You may notice that protein does not have a percent daily value. And the reason for that is that our protein needs are identified individually. So for example, your protein needs are based on your weight. So we can't really put a number there because everybody's protein needs are going to vary. The other numbers are really based on the dietary reference intake for that particular nutrient for most adults. So if you see a food label that has the percent daily value for protein, that is not mandatory and is not typically, I don't know, it's not really ideal because everybody's protein needs are different. And we can ask, if you have some questions about what these values mean, or what the terminology means, we can talk about that after the class here today. So the word on the sweet. So again, I mentioned that sugar could include either natural sugar or added sugar. Again, sucrose, glucose, dextrose, maltose, those are all added sugars. Things like lactose, fructose, galactose, those are naturally found sugars. When you look at the added sugars in a particular food, for every 4 grams, that is equivalent to 1 teaspoon of sugar. So if you have 12 grams of sugar in, say, a pack of instant oatmeal, that means that little packet has 3 teaspoons of added sugar. So, maybe a healthier choice would be to use rolled oats and add your own sugar to it, but use less, or you could use honey or something like that. So I'm not saying you can never have any sugar, but there's certainly ways around reducing the amount that's naturally found in the processed food. Again, the sugars are going to be listed under the total carbohydrate, which will include, again, the dietary fiber, total sugars, and then that new term that says includes added sugar. As far as the amount of ingredients listed, whatever the food has the most of will be listed first. And the nutrient that is the last is the nutrient that's, or the ingredient rather, that is in the least amount. The longer the list, obviously, the more additives or ingredients. And it's interesting that right now, and this isn't really that new, but consumers really don't want a whole lot of additives in their food. And I totally get that. Obviously, we don't want a lot of artificial colors or artificial flavors or artificial dyes. But what I find interesting is some of the food companies have actually backed off on fortifying certain foods in order to shorten that list. And that's not necessarily a good thing. For example, nutrients like iron or folic acid or thiamine or riboflavin, those are all necessary for normal metabolism. Iron is necessary for healthy blood. B12 is necessary for healthy blood and for memory and all these different things. But when the company stops fortifying those foods, then those foods no longer become a source for those nutrients that are still really important in our diet. So you want to look at the label and see what's been added in. Again, if the fats don't add up, it's because only the saturated and trans fat have to be listed on the label, and mono and polyunsaturated fats may or may not be there. Typically, they're not going to be there, so that number, that the total grams of fat will not add up, and that's okay. But a lot of people don't understand why that is, and it's just that they don't need to be there by law. Now, as far as other things that you might see, I'm going to kind of go over what those dates on your labels mean, the percent daily value, low fat versus no fat, reduced calorie, healthy, natural, low sodium, reduced sodium, gluten-free, health claims, organic, and GMO. And I know this is a lot of information, but hopefully it'll be a fun ride. All right. So first thing to start with is that the sell by, best by, or best if used by, or use by date is not required, with the exception of infant formula, which was a complete nightmare during the pandemic because there was one very major production. One of the Abbott facilities in Michigan had some issues with contamination, and it really shut down the whole industry, which was really scary because people need their infant formula. But by law, the dates on food is not required. It's really done as an inventory management type of system. So these are typically driven by the grocery stores or the grocery store industry. Most of your processed foods, so things like cereal and canned food, those are fairly shelf stable. So you're going to see a use by or best by date that's gone out for at least a couple years. The best if used by means that the product will have either the best taste or the best quality. It does not have anything really to do with the safety of the product. Usually you're going to see this on eggs and meat and poultry. Now, obviously, if the meat is on the discount section and it looks kind of green, you're probably taking some chances with buying that meat because, you know, everything spoils at some point. The use by or last used by the last date. Sorry, my slides are blocked by the little bar at the bottom. These are recommended for peak quality. So again, these labels are not mandatory. They are typically used for inventory management, so the store knows, like, you know, how to move the milk forward, or, you know, what milk is going to expire first. I would really go by the smell of the food. So obviously, if your milk smells sour or off, don't drink it. Take it back to the store and get a refund. But things like eggs, those can last a lot longer than that little date that's on the carton. And I would say at least 2 or 3 weeks. Something like yogurt that already has bacteria in it, that's going to last a lot longer than that little date that's on the carton. And we see a lot of food waste related to people just throwing things out because, you know, they see that date and they get panicked and they throw it out. Obviously, if the food looks slimy or spoiled, don't take your chances and go ahead and throw it out. But for the most part, our food will really last a lot longer as long as it's kept, you know, in the correct temperature. So as long as it's been refrigerated or frozen appropriately, you should be fairly safe. So as I mentioned earlier with the percent daily value, this just compares or evaluates the nutrient in the food with the daily intake for that nutrient based on a 2,000 calorie diet. Now, everybody's dietary needs are going to be a little bit different. 2,000 is just an estimate for most adults. Usually it is not listed for protein because protein needs are individual. Anything 5% or less is low in that nutrient, and anything 20% or higher of the daily value is high. Butter contains about 36% of the daily value for saturated fat, which obviously is very high. Another source of saturated fat would be beef. Coconut oil is highly saturated. Cheese, you're going to see a lot of saturated fat in particularly full fat cheese or full fat dairy products. Ice cream, those sorts of things are going to be high in that saturated fat. And again, we want to eat less of that because of its connection or association with the risk for heart disease. Again, this is just a percent daily value on a label. So again, if something has 4.5 grams of fat or more, that's going to be high in that particular nutrient. I think the cutoff is about 3 grams of saturated fat for something to be high in saturated fat, or more than that. I'm not sure what this food is, but obviously it's pretty high in sodium. Most of your packaged foods, frozen items, canned soup, fast food, that's where you're going to get most of your sodium. You're also going to get some salt or sodium from a salt shaker, but the majority of the sodium that most consumers consume is really from packaged foods. And again, that added sugar will be listed separately under the sugars, and then the vitamin D and calcium and iron and potassium are listed below. And so this is what a typical nutrition facts label will include. If something is listed either no fat or fat-free, it can have 0.5 grams of fat per serving or less. So if you have something that has 10 servings and it says no fat, it might still have some fat in it if it only has 0.5 gram of fat per serving or less, if you consume the whole thing. So you need to make sure that whatever number of servings that you're eating, you multiply that number by whatever the nutrient is in that food. A food that is considered low fat is below 3 grams of fat per serving. Something that is lean has less than 10 grams of fat, 3 grams of saturated fat or less, and 95 milligrams of cholesterol per 100 grams or less. You may also see terms like extra lean, which means that it has half of that fat. Typically foods that are extra lean are going to be those that are about 90% lean or higher. So when we buy things like ground beef or ground turkey, it's going to be labeled 93/7, 96/4. The type of fat that's in there might vary a little bit, but the amount of fat's going to be the same in 85% fat turkey and 85% ground beef. Even though they're different, the fat content is going to be the same. So make sure that you're looking to see the total fat in addition to the saturated fat in that food. And again, anything that's about 90% lean or higher is typically a lower fat, or at least a lean source of protein. So again, this is an old label. It still includes the vitamin A and vitamin C, but you'll see that it's listed as extra lean. Again, by law, they can put that on there because the total fat is below 5 grams in a serving, and the saturated fat is only 1.5 grams, where 3 grams can be considered either lean or low fat. You may see things listed as low calorie or reduced calorie. Those also have terms. So for something that is low calorie, it's 1/3 of the calories of the original version. Reduced calorie is 1/4 less than the original version. So again, all of these terms are defined by law. Something that says no calorie or calorie free is below 5 calories per serving. And you may notice that on something kind of ridiculous, but a stick of gum has maybe 10 calories. And so on the label in very, very tiny font, you'll see something that says not a low calorie food. And so they have to put that there because it still has a handful of calories in that stick of gum. Even though it's really kind of low, it adds up if you chew an entire pack of gum. Now, the term healthy for a while really didn't have terminology around it. And the reason that I have a kind bar there is that the Kind company was actually sued by another, I think it was another granola bar group or some consumer group, because the term healthy was listed on the label and we really didn't have a term for it. So the problem with that is foods that were not really healthy. And the reason that this company or the consumers complained about it being listed as healthy was because Kind bars have a significant amount of fat in them. However, the type of fat that is there is not necessarily unhealthy fat. So the majority of fat in those bars is either mono or polyunsaturated fats. So they changed the law so that the food does not necessarily have to be low in total fat, but can be made up of mostly, polyunsaturated fats or, monounsaturated fats, which again are heart healthy. The other thing is that if the food contains at minimum 10% of the daily value for something like potassium or vitamin D, they can use the term healthy. So in this case, the Kind company sort of won the lawsuit and they were allowed to put this on a label, because otherwise things like pudding would be allowed to have the term healthy primarily just because of the fat content, which really doesn't make any sense because there's not a lot of food in that food. There's not much nutritional value to pudding except maybe a little bit of calcium, but the primary ingredient in there is sugar. So this is where sort of the healthy term is now allowed on a label, but we have better terminology to define what that can be. I mentioned earlier that the FDA really does not have a definition for the use of the term natural. It is allowed to be used if the food doesn't have any added color, artificial flavor, or synthetic substances. So I find it kind of funny that something like Cheetos can be listed as, quote, natural, but they must use some sort of natural dye that's, some sort of magic cheddar dust. I don't know what it is. But this doesn't necessarily make this a healthy food. So you still want to look at what are those nutrients in that particular snack food. And I mentioned snack foods because those are probably the most processed foods of the things that most of us would eat. Sodium is listed on a food label because too much raises the risk for high blood pressure. Too much sodium is also linked with kidney disease. It can also be linked with bone loss. So you don't want to get too much salt in your diet. The dietary reference intake is about 2,300 milligrams per day, but it is much less if you are over the age of 50, if you already have diagnosed high blood pressure, kidney disease, congestive heart failure, individuals that have ascites or some type of liver disease are often suggested to also follow a low sodium diet. The sources of sodium that you're typically going to see are things like breakfast and lunch meat, bacon, sausage, Canadian bacon, which is basically ham, canned goods, fast foods, frozen meals, chips and snacks. That's primarily where we get most of our sodium. You're also going to find it in condiments, ketchup, barbecue sauce, teriyaki sauce, soy sauce, fish sauce, all of those types of things. So again, just pay attention to the label. If you can, I would try to buy low sodium versions of those condiments, or low sodium lunch meat, low sodium cheese where you can. Another source of sodium that a lot of people don't think about is bread. So like a slice of bread has a couple 100 milligrams of sodium, which is a lot. I mean, that's not insignificant when you eat, a sandwich or a slice of toast here and there during the day. So just kind of pay attention to how much is on the label. The terms sodium-free means that it can have less than 5 milligrams of sodium per serving. Very low sodium is below 35 milligrams. Low sodium is 140. And again, below 5% of the daily value on the label is considered low. So that's about 140 milligrams or less. You might see 115, say 5%. They give it a little bit of leeway because of that, 35 milligram kind of window. I have a little picture of Skyline there. Not that I don't love Skyline like everybody else, but that's probably the worst offenders of sodium. Between the cheese and the meat, you're just looking at pretty much 3 days worth of sodium and a couple servings. It's very, very high in salt, very high in sodium. Some other terms that you may see, again, reduced sodium, light in sodium or lightly salted, no salt added or unsalted, which typically you're going to see on something like a canned food. So just make sure that you're checking the label. Just because the food says no salt added doesn't mean that it doesn't have a little bit of natural sodium in it. So just kind of check and see how much is in there. For the most part, things like frozen vegetables, unless they're in some type of sauce or some type of like cream sauce or cheese sauce or something, those are usually sodium free. So frozen vegetables are perfectly healthy to use, and they're a great alternative if you want something that has a little bit longer shelf life and a little bit more variety in your diet, because I fully recognize that fresh fruits and vegetables are not always readily available and they do perish pretty quickly. I have a lot of different frozen veggies in my freezer for that reason. I always get questions about gluten. So gluten is just a protein that's found in barley and rye and wheat, primarily seen in bread, cereal, pasta, pastries. It can be hidden in different things, so it may be found also in condiments. Really, the most important population to avoid gluten is people that have celiac disease, which is a very sort of rare autoimmune condition where the person cannot digest gluten. And really only 1% of the population has either celiac disease or what we call non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So for example, there's been some data that people that have irritable bowel syndrome might have a gluten sensitivity, or people with other autoimmune conditions may have a gluten sensitivity. So something like rheumatoid arthritis or insulin-dependent diabetes, sometimes there is a connection with gluten there, even if the person does not have celiac disease. The disadvantage of gluten-free products is that they are very expensive, or they tend to be more expensive. There really is not any good data that says that they are healthier than gluten-containing foods, with the exception of, if you have a family history of celiac disease and you have like a mother that is pregnant that obviously can't have gluten, if there's, contamination in her diet from either, cross-contamination from a restaurant, or she consumed gluten in some other way, that might impact the child's risk for celiac disease down the road. For the most part, again, there is no evidence that gluten-free is healthier. If anything, it is lower in fiber, because you're taking away, barley and rye and wheat, which are, significant sources of fiber in our diet. Foods can contain 20 parts per million of gluten and be labeled gluten-free. So there might be a trace amount, but not enough that would impact somebody with the condition of celiac disease. Other foods that are going to contain gluten that aren't listed or weren't listed before. So beer and malt beverages, obviously, because they're, fermented barley, canned soup, frozen meals, soy sauce, condiments, lunch meats, malt vinegar. And then if some salad dressings have those ingredients that are listed, so hydrolyzed wheat protein, wheat gluten, triticum lipids, malt extract, those are also sources of gluten. I would say the majority of clients that I see that either have celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, they make their own salad dressing, or they often make their own bread, or they their whole house is gluten-free versus trying to navigate a gluten-free section of their kitchen, or a gluten-free toaster. I mean, all of those things have to be modified when somebody has celiac disease, and it's a very tricky condition. The good news is there are lots of gluten-free products available, but again, they are more expensive and they aren't necessarily indicated for most of the population. Okay, so now I'm going to look at just a handful of health claims, because there's way more health claims that I probably need to cover, but I can certainly discuss a little of them, or more of them. So we know that calcium intake reduces osteoporosis risk. So for example, if a milk company wanted to put that on their label, they certainly could, because that is a valid health claim. Sodium increases high blood pressure risk. Obviously, a company's probably not going to highlight how much sodium is in their food. Dietary fat increases cancer risk. Saturated fat and cholesterol increase the risk for coronary artery disease or coronary heart disease. The reason that we don't put those on there is we don't want to scare people. But again, we want to educate people on why those nutrients are listed in the nutrition facts part of the food label. Folate reduces neural tube defect risk. And as I mentioned earlier, when we start taking away fortification of grains in particular, that actually raises the risk for neural tube defects. So I think it was about 1996 where companies started adding folic acid, which is supplemental folate, into grains in order to reduce the risk for folic acid, for neural tube defects, things like spina bifida. So what makes me very nervous when companies decide that it's better to have less ingredients and they stop the fortification process. So we're really going to have to take a look at that. Dietary sugar raises dental cavity risk. Fruits and vegetables help to reduce cancer risk, and soy protein, so things like soy milk, tofu, help to reduce the risk for coronary heart disease. So some of these things you may see on a label, but again, it's going to cost the company a little bit more to add these as health claims. Okay, so now we'll move on to what an organic food is and what the regulations are. So for the most part, they have to be grown without synthetic pesticides. However, natural pesticides may be used in organic foods. So maybe something like Roundup isn't used, but a company or a farm could use a natural pesticide in order to reduce, insects or weeds or that type of thing. So when you hear that organic foods don't have any pesticides, that is kind of false. They just don't have synthetic pesticides. The feed for the animals, so when beef or chicken or other dairy products, eggs, milk are labeled as organic, the animal itself has to be fed 100% organic feed and not given any growth hormones or antibiotics. Things that are listed 100% organic means that everything in that food obviously is organic, and there are no bioengineered ingredients in that food. If the food is just listed organic, that means 95% of the ingredients used are organic. If it just says made with organic, at least 70% of the ingredients are considered organic. And again, this is a more expensive certification. Organic foods, for that reason, are going to be more expensive to purchase. Again, it prohibits the use of synthetic chemicals, irradiation, sewage sludge, or any genetically engineered organisms. The farmland where either the cows are grazing or the beef is raised or the eggs are raised, wherever, it needs to be free of any of that sewage or sludge or irradiation for at least 3 years. The company has to maintain very detailed records, and they need to be open to periodic unannounced on-site inspections. So again, it is more expensive for a farmer to grow organic crops, and it is for this reason, because their land needs to be a specific way. Their cattle, their chickens, they all need to be fed a certain way. And it does increase the cost of purchase price. And you've probably already noticed the cost of food is really much higher because of the pandemic and fuel costs and everything else. So a genetically modified organism, which will now be sort of termed bioengineered, is basically a food where scientists have changed the genes of plants and animals with DNA from different species of living organisms or bacteria or viruses in order to get specific traits. So some of those traits include resistance to disease, tolerance of pesticides, and nutrient retention. So we may genetically modify a food in order to put more of a particular nutrient in it. So for example, years ago, there was a product called golden rice, where a company added more beta carotene or added beta carotene to a rice plant in order to reduce the risk of vitamin A deficiency in third world countries, which is the leading cause of blindness. So a lot of people get very paranoid about, bioengineered foods or genetically modified organisms, but there is some benefit to it and there's reason behind it. So I always get this question are whether or not they are safe, and anything that sounds scary to people will sound scary to people. The good news is that bioengineered foods are tested over and over and over again for safety. The levels of nutrients are very close or match identically to traditionally bred plants. So the fiber, the protein, the essential fatty acids, the vitamins, minerals, all those different nutrients are the same as what you would get in a traditionally grown or organic crop. The information on safety includes the biotechnology. We have an evaluation team that looks at the safety and compliance with the law. Now, if you are nervous about bioengineered foods, organic food does not contain any genetically modified organisms, or again, these bioengineered ingredients. The foods that are bioengineered in the US include alfalfa sprouts, apples, canola oil, corn oil, cotton, flax plants, papaya, pink pineapple, which honestly I've never seen before, plums, potatoes, salmon, soy, sugarcane, and summer squash, such as zucchini. We do not have bioengineered wheat. We do not have bioengineered tomatoes. So if you hear that, that is false. These are the only products on the market that may contain bioengineered ingredients. The newest ones are apples. And the reason that they bioengineered apples was to reduce the browning. So people will throw out an apple once it starts to, kind of turn brown, once it becomes oxidized. And so there's a company called Arctic Apple that basically bioengineered the apple so it doesn't turn brown. And I know, like when my kids were little, if the apple turned brown, they wouldn't eat it. And so we have a lot of food waste related to that. So it sort of improved the quality of the apple by reducing that browning process. So as of January this year, any food that has been bioengineered will need to be labeled. Now, the problem with that is it, is seen as probably causing a little bit more consumer confusion, because not every food that has bioengineered ingredients is required to disclose that on a label. So if the amount of bioengineered ingredient is minimal or undetectable, then the food does not have to be listed. Meat, poultry, and eggs are exempt from the label. So it's unclear, unless, again, you buy organic food, if that particular animal that you're purchasing has been exposed to bioengineered ingredients. Personally, I am not afraid of bioengineered foods. If anything, they're tested probably more regularly than, crops that a farmer would basically modify himself. So things like seedless watermelon, seedless grapes, those are not genetically engineered, but they are engineered by a farmer or somebody that's somebody in agriculture to change the plant, but we don't necessarily test those. So just food for thought. The way that you can spot if a food contains a bioengineered ingredient, it will say contains bioengineered food ingredient. You'll see either one of these symbols in either black and white or a color. There will also be a QR code, because we're becoming so digital savvy, or a phone number that consumers can either call or text will be listed on the label in order to get more information about the food. So just some final thoughts before I open it up to questions. Obviously, reading labels keeps you informed about what you eat. And we're going to see changes in labels as consumer demand for products changes. I don't know the age of this group, but I remember I guess it was the 90s, where now I can't remember the name of it. Oh, Snackwell cookies were really popular. And, after that particular product came out, anything that was, quote, healthy was in a green label or a green package. It turned out those things were still really high in sugar, and people ended up gaining weight anyway, but it was one of the first foods I remember with a very distinct label. So labels are going to change as the consumer demand for products increases. If you're interested in learning more about organic fruits and vegetables, there's a really great website just called safefruitsandveggies.com, because I know people are nervous about pesticides. However, you'd be amazed at how much of a food that you can eat and not be exposed to either pesticides or chemicals. So take a look at that website if you get a chance. And if you're at all concerned about bioengineered ingredients, then I would purchase organic food, although you are going to pay a higher price. If you want more information, these are my social media handles. So in my website as well, I usually have some type of recipe or a product review or that type of thing on my site. So I welcome any comments or questions. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording so we can open the floor to any questions.